The grand atrium of Monarch Industries gleamed under a constellation of crystal chandeliers, every surface polished to reflect the power assembled within. 300 executives stood in tailored silence as Eleanor Vance descended the marble staircase, her presence commanding the room like gravity commands the tide. Near the service entrance, pressed against the wall with his 7-year-old daughter's hand in his, stood a janitor named Thomas Brennan. When he shifted his weight forward, just one small step to see past the crowd, every head turned. And for the first time, Eleanor Vance's gaze fell upon a man the world had taught her not to see. Thomas Brennan had not always pushed a mop through the hallways of corporate towers. But the path that led him here was not a story he told anyone, not even himself on most nights. What mattered now was the rhythm. Clock in at 10. Work until 6 in the morning. Take the bus home while the city still slept. Make breakfast for Lily before she woke. Sit with her through cereal and cartoons. Then walk her to school with whatever energy remained in his bones. Sleep 4 hours, do it again. Their apartment in South Boston occupied the 3rd floor of a building that groaned in winter and sweated in summer. 2 bedrooms, though the second was barely larger than a closet. Thomas had painted it lavender because Lily said it was the color of dreams, and he would have painted the whole city lavender if she had asked. The walls held her drawings. Crooked houses, stick-figure families, a sun that smiled in every single one. On this particular morning, 3 days before the Monarch Industries gala that would change everything, Lily sat at their small kitchen table with a bowl of oatmeal growing cold before her. She watched her father move through the kitchen, his movements slow with exhaustion, but his voice warm when he spoke. "Eat up, sweetheart. Bus comes in 20 minutes. Daddy," she said, stirring the oatmeal without eating it. "Why do people look at you like that?" Thomas paused at the sink. "Like what?" "Like at the grocery store yesterday. That lady looked at you like you were doing something wrong. But you were just buying milk." He turned, drying his hands on a dish towel that had seen better years. The question sat between them, honest and terrible in the way only a child's question can be. Thomas knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. "Some people," he said carefully, "they see the uniform before they see the person. They see the job, and they make up a whole story in their heads about who you are, without ever asking." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "But you know who I am, right? You're my daddy." "That's right, and that's the only story that matters." She considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice, then nodded and took a bite of oatmeal. Thomas watched her eat, and in that small kitchen with its water-stained ceiling and second-hand furniture, he felt something close to peace. What Lily did not know, what Thomas had buried so deep it rarely surfaced even in his dreams, was that he had once worn a different kind of uniform. There were years, before her mother's death, before the medical bills that consumed everything, when Thomas Brennan had been someone else entirely. Someone who solved problems. Someone who built systems. Someone whose name appeared on patents that still generated royalties he would never see, because desperation had made him sign those rights away to pay for treatment that ultimately failed. He did not speak of this, not because he was ashamed of who he had become, but because he was afraid that Lily might grow up thinking her father had fallen. He wanted her to see only forward motion, only possibility, only a man who showed up every single day and did what needed to be done. The night before the gala, Thomas worked his usual shift at Monarch Industries. The building transformed around him as decorators arrived, as florists constructed elaborate arrangements, as technicians tested lighting and sound. He moved through it all like a ghost, invisible by design. At 3 in the morning, he paused in the corridor outside the executive boardroom, his mop resting against the wall. Through the glass, he could see the preparations, the stage where Eleanor Vance would announce her company's newest acquisition, the podium where speeches would be made, the seating arranged in precise hierarchies of importance. A security guard passed, nodded at Thomas. "Long night? They all are." The guard continued on, and Thomas returned to his work. He did not know that in 48 hours he would stand in that room. He did not know that his daughter's voice would echo off those walls. He did not know that the woman whose empire this building represented would look at him and see, for the first time, something she had spent her entire life avoiding. He only knew that the floor needed to be cleaned by morning. And so he cleaned. Eleanor Vance had built Monarch Industries from a single patent and a second mortgage into a telecommunications empire valued at $4.7 billion. She had done this through intelligence, through relentless work, through a willingness to make decisions that softer people could not stomach. At 53, she commanded respect the way some people commanded armies, and she had learned long ago that looking down meant losing sight of the horizon. The morning of the gala, she stood in her corner office on the 42nd floor, reviewing the final details of the acquisition announcement. Her chief of staff, a sharp-eyed man named Richard Calloway, delivered updates in the clipped cadence she preferred. Security is in place. Press credentials verified. The governor confirmed his attendance. And the other matter, Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Handled. The facility's staff have been instructed to remain in designated areas during the event. There was some confusion about access, but it's resolved. Confusion? One of the night janitors, Thomas Brennan. His daughter's school had some emergency, and he asked to bring her to the building during his shift. Normally against policy, but his supervisor made an exception. I've made it clear this won't happen again. Eleanor turned from the window. A child in the building? Briefly, during non-business hours. It won't affect the gala. She studied Richard for a long moment. He had been with her for 7 years, had proven himself invaluable in managing the countless details that powered an empire. But lately, she had noticed something in him, an edge, a willingness to cut corners that hadn't been there before. Fine, she said, just ensure everything runs smoothly. Always. What Eleanor did not know, could not have known, was that Richard's interest in Thomas Brennan had nothing to do with a child in the building. 3 weeks earlier, Richard had made a mistake. A significant financial irregularity had appeared in the accounts he managed, the result of a personal investment gone catastrophically wrong. To cover it, he had needed to create a paper trail that led somewhere, anywhere, other than himself. Thomas Brennan, with his night shifts and his access to every floor of the building, had provided the perfect target. Richard had carefully planted evidence, doctored security logs, created a narrative of petty theft that would, if discovered, point directly at the janitor who moved through Monarch Industries like a shadow. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the gala began. The atrium, filled with bodies and expensive fabrics, with voices practiced in the art of saying nothing important, with the particular energy of people who believed they mattered more than most. Thomas should not have been there. His shift had ended at 6 that morning, but Lily's school had closed unexpectedly, a water main break flooding half the building, and he had nowhere else to bring her. His supervisor, a decent man named George, had bent the rules. "Stay in the back," George had said. "Keep her quiet. I'll cover for you." So Thomas stood near the service entrance, Lily's hand in his, watching a world that operated on principles entirely foreign to his own. Lily watched too, her eyes wide at the chandeliers, the flowers, the women in gowns that probably cost more than her father earned in a year. "It's like a princess movie," she whispered. "It's like something," Thomas agreed. When Eleanor Vance descended the staircase, the room went silent. She moved with the kind of certainty that comes from decades of being proven right, and when she reached the podium, every camera in the room focused on her face. Lily tugged at Thomas's sleeve. "Is she the princess? She's the boss. Of what? Of all of this?" Then it happened. Lily spotted someone across the room, a catering staff member holding a tray of appetizers. Her hand slipped from Thomas's grip as she moved forward, fascinated by the tiny foods arranged like art. Thomas stepped after her, one small step, and in doing so, moved out of the shadows and into the light. The room did not fall silent. Eleanor did not stop her speech. But Thomas felt eyes turning, felt the weight of judgment from those nearest to him. A janitor, in uniform, at a corporate gala, with a child. Richard Calloway appeared beside him within moments. "You need to leave." "Now. I'm just getting my daughter. This is a private event. Staff are not permitted." The exchange was quiet, but not quiet enough. People were watching now. Thomas saw Eleanor pause mid-sentence, her gaze sweeping the back of the room, finding the source of the disturbance. "Daddy?" Lily had returned to his side, sensing the tension. Richard's voice dropped to a hiss. "I don't care what arrangement you made with your supervisor. This is inappropriate. You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing the company." Thomas felt the old familiar weight. The understanding that in certain spaces, he was not a person but a problem to be solved. He had learned, long ago, to swallow this weight, to let it pass through him without leaving marks. "We'll go," he said quietly. But Richard was not finished. He was thinking of the evidence he had planted, the investigation that would soon begin. The need to establish Thomas as exactly the kind of person who would cause problems. "This is typical," Richard said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "No judgment, no consideration. This is why certain people remain where they are." The words hung in the air. Lily looked up at her father, confusion and hurt mixing in her eyes. She had understood, perhaps for the first time, that the look she had asked about at breakfast was not an accident. It was a system. Thomas squeezed her hand. "Come on, sweetheart." They walked toward the exit, and the gala resumed behind them as if they had never been there at all. Eleanor Vance returned to her speech. The audience returned to their performance of attention, and in the corner of the atrium, a 7-year-old girl learned that the world could be very cold to the people she loved most. The loading dock behind Monarch Industries smelled of exhaust and cardboard, a utilitarian space that existed to be forgotten. Thomas sat on an overturned crate, Lily beside him, both of them staring at the concrete floor. "Daddy, why did that man say those things?" "Because he doesn't know us." But they weren't true. No. They weren't. Lily kicked her feet, her sneakers scuffed from months of playground use. "It made me feel bad, like we did something wrong." Thomas pulled her close. "You didn't do anything wrong, not one single thing. Neither of us did. Then why do we have to leave?" It was the question he could not answer. Not honestly. Not without explaining the mechanisms of power to a child who still believed in fairness, who still drew suns that smiled. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people with a lot of power make rules that protect their own world, and when someone from outside that world comes in, even by accident, it reminds them that there's a whole lot of life they're not paying attention to. That makes them uncomfortable. And uncomfortable people sometimes act ugly." Lily considered this. "Is the boss lady uncomfortable? Maybe. I don't know." "She looked at you," Lily said. "When we were leaving. She looked right at you." Thomas had felt it. That brief moment when Eleanor Vance's eyes had found him in the crowd. He had expected dismissal, maybe annoyance. What he had seen instead was harder to name, something closer to recognition. As if she had seen not just a janitor causing a disturbance, but a specific human being with a specific face. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." But they would not make it home. Not yet. Inside, the gala had progressed to the portion of the evening where speeches gave way to mingling, where deals were made in corners and futures were decided over champagne. Eleanor moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting congratulations, fielding questions, maintaining the performance of control that had defined her public life. But something had shifted. That moment in the back of the room had lodged in her like a splinter. The child's face, the man's quiet dignity, the way Richard had spoken to them. She found Richard near the bar. The disturbance earlier. What exactly happened? Minor issue. A maintenance worker brought his child to the building against policy. Handled it how? Richard's smile was practiced. I asked them to leave, firmly but professionally. Eleanor studied him. The things you said, I heard them. Certain people remain where they are. I was frustrated. It won't happen again. She might have let it go. She had let many things go over the years, small cruelties that accumulated like sediment at the bottom of any large organization. But tonight, for reasons she could not quite articulate, she did not want to let it go. Find out who they are, she said. The man and the child. I want their names. Richard's expression flickered. Is that really necessary? I'm not asking you to investigate them. I'm asking you to identify them. Is that a problem? No. Of course not. He walked away, and Eleanor returned to the gala. But the celebration felt different now. The congratulations felt hollow, and when she looked around the glittering atrium, she could not stop seeing the space where that man had stood, holding his daughter's hand, being told he did not belong. The crisis happened at 11 minutes past 8. A power surge had affected the building's main servers, and the presentation screens throughout the atrium flickered and died just as Eleanor was preparing for the evening's final announcement. We're working on it, someone said. Technical team is on it. But the technical team was overwhelmed, and the servers were not responding to standard protocols. Eleanor stood at the podium, the audience growing restless, her empire's most important public moment crumbling in real time. Thomas was still in the loading dock when George found him. We've got a problem upstairs. Servers are down, and nobody can figure out why. That's not my department. No, but you used to be in tech, didn't you? Before all this? Thomas went very still. How do you know that? I pay attention. And right now, there are 300 very important people watching screens that won't turn on. If you know something that could help, I'm just a janitor, George. Yeah, and I'm just a guy who's worked here for 20 years and knows when someone's hiding something. I'm not asking for your story. I'm asking if you can fix what's broken. Thomas looked at Lily, who had fallen asleep on a pile of flattened boxes. He thought about walking away, about keeping his head down, about the system that had taught him, over and over, that invisibility was safety. Then he thought about the man who had humiliated him in front of his daughter, about the woman who had watched and said nothing, about all the times he had accepted less than he deserved because demanding more felt like too much risk. Watch her, he said. I'll be back. The server room was chaos. 3 technicians huddled over equipment, their voices tight with frustration. When Thomas entered, still in his janitor's uniform, they barely glanced at him. Wrong room, buddy. Your failover cluster isn't initializing because your load balancer is trying to authenticate against a primary that doesn't exist anymore. The surge probably corrupted the routing table. You need to manually reassign the virtual IPs before the system will recognize the backup nodes. The technician stared. That's one of them started. How do you? Thomas was already at a terminal, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the muscle memory of 1,000 nights he had tried to forget. Within 4 minutes, the screens in the atrium flickered back to life. Within 6, the system was stable. He was gone before anyone could ask his name. But Eleanor Vance had seen. She had come to the server room when her staff could not tell her what was happening. And through the glass window, she had watched a janitor repair what her entire technical team could not. The same janitor Richard had dismissed as an embarrassment. The same man who had looked at her with something that was not anger, not resentment, but something far more unsettling. Understanding. The next morning, Richard Calloway launched his attack. He had spent the night preparing, refining the evidence he had manufactured, ensuring that Thomas Brennan would become the perfect scapegoat for the financial irregularities that threatened Richard's own career. The accusation was delivered in a meeting Thomas was not invited to but was summoned to attend. 3 members of corporate security, the head of human resources, Richard himself playing the role of concerned executive. We've discovered a pattern of irregularities in the maintenance department's petty cash fund, Richard explained, his voice smooth with false regret. Security footage appears to show Mr. Brennan accessing areas outside his authorized zones on multiple occasions, and there's a discrepancy in the supply orders that traces directly to his shift logs. Thomas sat in a plastic chair, still wearing the uniform he had not had time to change out of, and listened to his life being dismantled with surgical precision. "These are serious allegations," the HR director said. "The evidence appears substantial." "I didn't steal anything," Thomas said quietly. "The footage. I don't know what footage you have, but I've never taken anything that wasn't mine." Richard leaned forward. "No one's saying you're a bad person, Thomas. We understand financial pressures, a single father, working nights. But we have a responsibility to the company." The words were designed to wound, to paint Thomas as desperate, as predictable, as exactly the kind of person who would do exactly what he was accused of doing. And the worst part was that no one in the room questioned it. They saw the uniform. They saw the job. They made up the story. "I want to see this evidence," Thomas said. "You'll have a chance to respond through the formal process." "No. I want to see it now." But he would not be allowed to see it. He would be escorted from the building. His access badge would be deactivated. And that night, when he returned to his apartment and held his sleeping daughter, Thomas Brennan would understand that the system had finally caught up with him. He had been invisible for years. And now, when visibility meant survival, no one would look. 3 days after Thomas's termination, Eleanor Vance called an all-hands meeting to address the incident. It was meant to be routine. A statement about integrity, a reminder that theft would not be tolerated, a signal to investors that Monarch Industries policed its own. Thomas was not supposed to be there, but George had let him into the building through a service entrance, and he stood in the back of the auditorium, Lily beside him, watching the woman who owned everything address the people who served her. Eleanor's speech was careful, measured. She did not mention Thomas by name, but everyone knew. The story had traveled through the building like fire. The janitor who had stolen, the janitor who had been caught, the janitor who had brought his child to a corporate gala like he belonged. When Eleanor finished speaking, she opened the floor for questions. The executives in the front rows sat in comfortable silence. The middle managers maintained their practiced neutrality. No one spoke, and then a small voice cut through the auditorium. "My daddy didn't steal anything." Every head turned. Lily stood in the aisle, 7 years old and trembling, but her voice did not waver. "He works really hard. He comes home tired every day. He makes me breakfast even when he hasn't slept. And he never, ever takes things that aren't his. He told me that's what honest people do." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor Vance stood at the podium, frozen, staring at the child who had just challenged her in front of 300 employees. "Young lady," someone began, but Lily was not finished. "The man who said bad things to us at the party, he's the one who lies. I heard him on the phone. He said he was going to make sure Daddy got blamed for something he didn't do." Richard Calloway's face went white. Thomas stepped forward, his hand reaching for Lily's shoulder. "Sweetheart, that's enough. But it's true, Daddy. I heard him." The auditorium erupted, voices overlapping. Questions shouted, Richard moving toward the exit. And through it all, Eleanor Vance remained motionless at the podium, her eyes fixed on the man in the janitor's uniform who was kneeling beside his daughter, whispering words no microphone could capture. She had built an empire on information, on knowing what others did not, on seeing patterns before they emerged, and in that moment, watching a child speak truth to power with nothing but conviction, Eleanor Vance realized that she had missed the most important pattern of all. She had stopped seeing people. The investigation that followed lasted 11 days. Eleanor ordered it personally, overriding Richard's protests, bringing in external auditors who owed nothing to the internal politics of Monarch Industries. What they found was both simpler and more damaging than anyone had expected. Richard Calloway had been embezzling for 18 months. The amount totaled over $2 million. siphoned through shell accounts and falsified vendor payments. When the scheme had begun to unravel, he had constructed an elaborate frame, using Thomas's access patterns, his financial vulnerabilities, his invisibility in the corporate hierarchy. The evidence was meticulous. Emails Richard had thought were deleted, digital fingerprints on doctored documents, a trail of transactions that led directly to accounts in his name. Eleanor reviewed the findings in her office, alone, at 2 o'clock in the morning. Outside her window, the city glittered with 10,000 lights, each one representing a life she had never considered. She had spent 30 years building this company. She had made sacrifices that still woke her at night, and she had allowed herself to believe that success absolved her of attention. She had looked at Thomas Brennan and seen a problem to be managed. She had looked at his daughter and seen an inconvenience. She had watched Richard humiliate them both and chosen to focus on her speech, on her announcement, on the performance of power that had become her entire identity. The next morning, she called a press conference. The announcement was brief but unequivocal. Richard Calloway had been terminated. Criminal charges would be filed. A complete review of internal protocols was underway, and Thomas Brennan was being reinstated with full back pay, a formal apology, and a position in the technical department where his skills could be properly utilized. What she did not say, what she could not say in front of cameras, was that she had watched the footage of Richard's confrontation with Thomas at the gala. She had heard every word, and she had seen, clearly and undeniably, that she had allowed it to happen. Richard was arrested in the lobby of Monarch Industries, in full view of the same employees who had witnessed Thomas's humiliation. The cameras captured him being led out in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief. He had believed himself untouchable. He had believed that power protected its own. He had been wrong. The aftermath was quieter than the crisis. The press moved on to other scandals. The employees returned to their routines, and Thomas Brennan found himself standing in an office on the 15th floor, wearing clothes that fit properly, preparing for a job that matched who he actually was. Eleanor found him there 3 weeks after the reinstatement. He was at a workstation, reviewing system architecture with the same focus she had seen in the server room the night of the gala. She knocked on the doorframe. "May I come in?" Thomas looked up. In his face, she saw the same thing she had seen that first night. Not anger, not triumph. Just the steady presence of a man who had survived. "It's your building." "It is. But this is your office. And I should ask." She entered, closing the door behind her. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I didn't come to apologize," Eleanor said finally. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Apologies are words. I came to tell you what I'm doing instead." She sat in the chair across from his desk, uninvited, breaking her own protocol. "I've established a fund, education and support for single parents employed by Monarch Industries, flexible scheduling, emergency childcare, tuition assistance. It's named after your daughter." Thomas blinked. "You named a fund after Lily? She's the one who told the truth when no one else would. That should be remembered. She's 7, and braver than most adults I know." Eleanor paused. "Including me." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Why are you really here?" The question hung between them, honest and uncomfortable. Eleanor considered deflecting, considered maintaining the distance that had protected her for decades. But something had shifted in those 11 days of investigation, in those sleepless nights reviewing evidence that proved her blindness. "Because I saw you," she said, "in the server room, in the loading dock, in the auditorium when your daughter spoke. I saw you, and I realized that I have spent my entire career training myself not to see, not to notice, not to let myself be touched by the lives of the people who make all of this possible." She gestured at the building around them. "I don't know how to undo that, but I know I want to try." Thomas was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "That man, Richard, he said something that night about certain people remaining where they are. about judgment and consideration. He met Eleanor's eyes. He was wrong about me, but I'm wondering if maybe you've been wrong about yourself too, thinking that where you are means you can't see anyone else. Eleanor felt something crack in her chest, a wall she had built so gradually she had forgotten it was there. I have a daughter, she said. Did you know that? She's 31 now. We haven't spoken in 6 years. She said I cared more about this company than I ever cared about her. She paused. She wasn't wrong. Thomas nodded slowly. Lily's mother died when she was 2. Cancer. Every day since then, I've been terrified that I'm not enough, that I'm failing her, that she'll grow up and realize her father was just a man who cleaned floors. She won't realize that. No. Because that's not what she sees when she looks at you. I watched her face in that auditorium. She sees a hero. Thomas smiled. The first real smile Eleanor had seen from him. She sees her dad. That's all I ever wanted to be. They sat in silence, 2 people who had spent their lives on opposite ends of the same system, finally seeing each other clearly. I don't know what happens next, Eleanor said. Neither do I, but I'd like to find out. If you're willing, Thomas considered her. Considered the woman who had watched him be humiliated and said nothing. Considered the woman who had torn apart her own company to find the truth. Considered the possibility that people could change, that systems could shift, that the walls between worlds were not as permanent as they seemed. Lily has a school play next week, he said. She's playing a tree. It's not a big part, but she's been practicing her leaf waving for a month. Eleanor laughed, surprising herself. A tree? She says trees are important. They give everyone oxygen. She's not wrong. She usually isn't. Thomas paused. You could come, if you wanted. It's not a gala. Just a bunch of kids in costumes and parents trying not to cry. Eleanor thought of the events she attended, the galas and fundraisers and corporate retreats, the performances of importance that had defined her life. I would like that, she said. Very much. 1 month later, on a Saturday morning in early spring, Thomas and Lily and Eleanor walked through Boston Common. The trees were beginning to bud, pale green against the gray sky. Lily ran ahead, chasing pigeons and pointing at every dog she saw. She's got a lot of energy, Eleanor observed. Thomas smiled. She got up at 5 to make sure we wouldn't be late. Late for what? You'll see. They walked in comfortable silence, 2 people who had found their way to something unexpected. Not romance, not yet, but something that might grow into it. A respect that had been earned through pain, a trust that had been built through honesty, a connection that neither had sought, but both had needed. Lily came running back. Come on, we're going to miss it. She grabbed Eleanor's hand with the same ease she grabbed her father's, pulling them both toward a small crowd gathered near the pond. Thomas caught Eleanor's eye and shrugged. She read about it somewhere, insisted we come. The crowd was watching the swans. Every spring, the swan boats returned to Boston Common, and every spring, families gathered to see them. It was a small thing, a tradition, a moment that most people would forget by afternoon. But Lily stood at the edge of the water, her eyes wide, and Eleanor understood why they had come. My mom used to bring me here, she said quietly. When I was small, before everything, I had forgotten. Thomas put his hand on her shoulder. Some things are worth remembering. The first boat glided out onto the water, and the crowd applauded. Lily cheered. Eleanor felt something warm in her chest, something she had spent decades trying not to feel. Hope. She looked at Thomas. At the man who cleaned in silence, who raised his daughter alone, who had been broken by a system that was supposed to protect him. She looked at Lily, at the child who had spoken truth when no one else would, who saw her father as a hero, who believed that trees were important because they gave everyone oxygen, and she looked at herself, at the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming, at the walls she had built and the walls she was learning to tear down. Thank you, she said. For what? For letting me see, Thomas smiled. It was the same smile he gave Lily when she asked hard questions, patient and kind and absolutely certain. You always could, he said. You just had to choose to look. The swan boats circled the pond. The spring sun broke through the clouds, and three people who had been strangers stood together at the edge of the water, watching something beautiful begin.